Welcome to Chapter 11, Lesson 2, and in this section we're going to talk about how America itself ends up in the war. Remember, in the first section we talk about how Europe gets in the war. We ended up with those rise of dictators, and then how those dictators move Europe towards war. We're going to talk about how America and the Pacific half of the world ends up in war a little bit here today. So, of course, our questions that we're looking at today are whether or not World War II could have been prevented, and why do some people not respond to problems when they see them? Why don't they respond to injustice while others do respond to injustice? So what we're going to see here are a couple of kind of answers to these questions today. We're going to take a look at America being what we call isolationist, and we're going to see how getting involved is actually against the law. Because of what America was thinking and feeling about world affairs at the time. And we will see FDR kind of pushing us with his policies towards helping those in the war. So let's take a look at this in a little more detail and see kind of how these questions and answers unfold. So what we need to kind of understand at the start here is that America and Americans are disgusted with the rest of the world because we had suffered hundreds of thousands of dead in World War I, many others wounded, in the countries that we had gone to fight against, where we had defeated them and we had helped set up democracies like Germany and Austria-Hungary and against Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. Well, now, people had fought and died in Europe, and now we have the rise of these dictators. So what did we fight and die for? Russia became the Soviet Union and got Joseph Stalin, and Tojo rose up in Japan, and we have Hitler and Mussolini in Italy and Germany, and Americans, as a result, in the 1920s, really start to support isolationism. And remember, we had talked about this before when we studied the 1920s, and we talked about arms control, and we talked about kind of building a wall and separating ourselves. And as we see these dictators kind of rise up in the 1930s, we turn to isolationism even more, especially when Europeans refuse to pay their loans. Europeans refused to pay their World War I loans because of the Great Depression. And while that makes sense, if you can't pay back money that you don't have, right? I mean, that just makes sense. But that doesn't really matter because Americans are upset. On top of that, we had been investigating our own economy from World War I, and a group called the Nye Committee, and we discovered that American companies that made weapons profited immensely off the death of American soldiers. And that really upset the American people, that these companies would be making tons of money off the death of Americans. So between the Nye Committee, which had found that out, between the rise of these dictators and Europeans refusing to pay their World War I loans back to us, Congress and the American people wanted at most to be neutral. And so you'll see Congress pass a bunch of what we call neutrality acts to encourage us to stay out of foreign affairs. In fact, by 1937, we were so isolationist that we said we, as Americans, would not even send anything at all, no trade, to any nation that is at war. We're just not going to do it because we don't want to risk getting tangled up in their business. So we're not going to ship weapons to any country at war or in a civil war on top of it. So, we want out. We want to be by ourselves. We don't want your problems anymore. It's not our problems, not in my backyard. So, you look at that question, right, which was, why do some people respond to injustice while others try to prevent it? Prevent injustice? It's not our problem, right? We were isolationists. So we don't want to get involved, So could we have prevented World War II? Maybe, right? But we're isolationists. There's no way to know. And particularly when you think about those neutrality acts, right? It was against the law to get involved with countries at war. So, I mean, really, when you think about it, was there anything we could have done if it would have been illegal for us to even get involved? So FDR, of course, as president, is going to see this, and he's going to realize that we're in a dangerous spot. So when he's elected for his second term in 1936, he's going to take a look at what he needs to do to help begin to change Americans' minds about engaging with the world. The first thing we need to know is that even though Americans were isolationists, we wanted to build a wall between ourselves and everyone else, Roosevelt was internationalist. Roosevelt believed that trade between nations kept us together. You know, I think about China, which is a dictatorship with terrible human rights, or Iran, another dictatorship with a poor record of human rights, or Cuba, another dictatorship with poor human rights. But we're beginning, and we do trade with these places. Why? Because if we are connected by trade, then if we fight each other, we hurt each other. The tighter we are in our economies, the closer we are in trade, the less likely we are to fight. Because if we fight, we hurt our own economy and our own people. So Roosevelt is going to look for ways to kind of push us closer and closer to getting more and more involved in the world. And I'm going to give you a couple different examples. In the early 1930s, Japan is going to invade China without a declaration of war. Well, why does that matter? Because technically, according to the laws of the world, that's illegal. You got to declare war. So FDR is going to say, well, you know what, we can sell weapons to China because there was it's not technically a war. Japan technically didn't declare war, so this really isn't a war. So we can help China fight Japan because they hadn't declared war. So there's an example of how Roosevelt's going to look for ways to kind of manipulate the law to get us more and more involved. When war breaks out in Europe in 1939, FDR is going to say, you know what, we need to help countries like France and Great Britain. But I understand that we don't want to take money or give loans because they didn't pay them back. Instead, why don't we give those countries weapons, but only weapons that they can pay for in cash? That way there's no loans. And Americans are like, okay, that's fine if they're paying in cash. You know, or another example, when France falls to Germany, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, he meets with Roosevelt, and they look for ways around the law to kind of make sure Britain can get the help it needs. And they say, well, what if we don't sell you anything, right? We don't have to sell it to you. What we could do is we could trade. We could deliver 50 warships to you that we don't need, and you could give us your bases in the Atlantic to use just in case things get crazy. Right, so Roosevelt kind of keeps looking for these ways to push us closer and closer towards helping other nations of the world. In fact, Roosevelt saw trouble on the horizon. He felt that it was coming. And part of that's part of one of the reasons why he does away with the tradition of George Washington and actually runs for a third term, because he's warning Americans that being neutral might drag us into war. It might not keep us out. It might actually drag us in. And FDR does win. And he looks at that as proof that Americans want to help Great Britain. So when he takes office, in 1940, he gives a speech in early 1941, January 1941, called The Four Freedoms. And he gives this speech as a reminder to Americans what'll happen if nations like Great Britain, democracies, fall, that we will end up losing our freedom from want, that we'll lose our prosperity that we have, our ability to kind of be together. We'll lose our freedom of worship, that we won't be allowed to worship the god or goddesses that we love. We won't be able to be free from fear, because war and dictatorship will always be on the horizon. And that we won't have freedom of speech if we lose to these dictatorships. So, you know, Roosevelt, in giving this speech, like the Four Freedoms speech, in his election in 1940, and all these other different ways around the Neutrality Acts that he comes up with, his goal is to help Americans realize that maybe we can prevent World War II, at least our involvement in it. But that's also kind of wishful thinking, to be honest, that's really what's going to happen. Because Japan and America are really kind of heading towards war in general. And here's what I want you to see about that. So, a couple things to take a look at. In particular, Roosevelt's going to look for ways to help Britain specifically. So, for example, one of the things he's going to do is propose a new law called the Lend-Lease Act. And what the Lend-Lease Act does is it says, we'll give you weapons, and you only have to pay for them if you break them. And if we say that your country is critical to the defense of the United States, then we can help defend you. So it's not about us getting involved, it's about us protecting ourselves. So, for example, in 1940, we begin to send weapons to Britain because Britain is the last democracy between us and Germany. In 1941, we send Lend-Lease weapons to China because it's the largest power in Asia that separates us from Japan. So we begin to look for ways in which we can help each other out. For example, even FDR and Churchill get together in Newfoundland, Canada, and they sit down and they say that our two countries will commit to democracy in the world after World War II is over. And we tell Churchill that we're going to make sure we look for an incident that will justify war with the Germans so that we can come and help out Britain. And really, this is a justification for us to get involved, a reason to get involved. In fact, German submarines, U-boats, had been actually firing on American destroyers, and we had been firing on German submarines. And one of our destroyers was even sunk in early 1941 with the Germans. And so war is essentially very close, but we're just not quite all the way there yet. How do we end up in war? And the answer there is that we don't actually end up in war with Germany, we end up in war with Japan first. And so here's what that looks like. We know that Japan was one of the Pacific powers, and here's a map that shows you all the big powers and players in the Pacific. And you can see here in the red, right, you can see all the territory that Japan owned or conquered. And you can see, if we zoom in here, that they had taken a lot of things in the early 1900s, whether that would be Korea, but we can also see in 1931 where it attacked China. And you could see America, right, with the Philippines over here, right? That was our colony that we had, the Philippines, right? We have Hawaii and Guam and Midway, and there's a bunch of other countries involved in the Pacific too. But what's clear is that Japan is expanding, right? It's kind of spreading its wings over time. So what we need to see is that Japan, in its war with China that had started in 1931, it needs a lot of different resources, and it gets those resources from us. And Japan wants to continue to expand. Remember, it wants to get out of the Great Depression, and it thinks expansion is the only way to do that. So it joins up as one of the Axis powers with Italy and Germany. And FDR looks at this and says, well, we got to be careful about this, right? I mean, take a look at that map again. Right? We've got islands here, Wake and Midway. We've got the Philippines. We've got American Samoa. We gotta do something here to slow down. We have Guam, this little island right there. We've got to do something here to slow down the Japanese advance because really they're getting really, really powerful. So FDR is going to do whatever it takes to kind of slow them down. He's going to limit what we sell to Japan. He's going to send Lend-Lease aid to China in 1941 to fight Japan. He's going to freeze any Japanese investments, any Japanese money in the United States. And what we see is Japan becoming increasingly desperate because of this for resources. In fact, they actually enter into negotiations with us to talk about getting their resources back, getting their money back from us, selling strategic materials to them, letting them continue to expand. And those negotiations go into the fall of 1941. But really what we know by like November of 1941 is that war is probably going to happen. We know, for example, that Japan was actually preparing for war with us. We had intercepted one of their codes, we had cracked it, we discovered that they were preparing for war, but we didn't know where they were going to attack, and we didn't know when. We'd even warned everyone, including commanders at Pearl Harbor, that there was going to be an attack. But we didn't know specifically that Hawaii would be a target. And so when December 7th, and I know it says July here, but we crossed that out, and it's December 7th. So on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese actually end up attacking it, a devastating attack, thousands dead, tons of our ships destroyed. And it's going to lead FDR to call December 7th a date which will live in infamy and us to declare war. And so it's not Germany at all that we end up at war with, even though we were trying to help Britain. It's Japan. And because Japan is allied with Germany, we end up at war with Germany too. So I think it's a good place to stop, and we'll continue on with this in class.